Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining. Thanks for those also watching this on YouTube on demand. This evening, we're going to be speaking to Kees Koenen about his book, The Betrayal of Colditz, which is the story of this man here, Ronald Bolton Littledale. Um, Firstly, just an introduction to Barnthorn for those that don't know us. We are an independent publisher, been going about 18 months now. We've got a growing stable of authors, for which Keys is a great part of. Mainly titles around military history, but also we touch on other genres as well. Um, I'm going to hand over to Keys now to introduce himself. Keys, tell us a little bit about your background, like both professionally and personal.
Okay, well, thank you actually for having me on this program. It's very kind of you to invite me and tell a little bit about my book. My name is Kees Koenen. I was born 60 years ago in the south of our country, the Netherlands, in a nice place called 's-Hertogenbosch. And well, history is my hobby. I'm a mathematical engineer, and I've been working for 33 years as a mechanical engineer in the oil and gas industry. And last December, I ended my job. I ended my career, and now I'm a full-time writer, you can say. Um, and well, I have many hobbies, but history is one of them. And as you can see behind me, there are a lot of books in my personal library. Not all about history. There's other stuff as well, but history and especially the Second World War is for me one of the major topics I like to study. And uh, there's a small interest, or no, there's one topic that interests me the most. That is Colditz, and it started when I was 10 or even younger when I saw the BBC television series. So I've been studying Colditz now for 50 years, and well, as you can see, even 50 years later, you still can come up with new stories of this castle over there in Germany.
Yeah, so I guess that leads on perfectly to the next question. So you mentioned obviously kind of a lifelong love affair, I guess, with Colditz. And when was the first time you visited Colditz Castle?
That was in 2006, and the year before, I'd met my wife, and together we made a tour through Germany. And of course, I always wanted to see Colditz, but it's almost impossible to get there. The train station closed down years ago. It takes you half a century to get there by bus, but my my wife could drive a car, so we went there, and we were there on a very special date, September the 25th, and we'll come to this later on in the program, I think. It was the day that one of the most famous prisoners called is Mike Sinclair was shot, actually. So it was a very special day. That was the first time I was in Colditz.
And I guess when did the idea of writing this book, land on your lap, so to speak? Obviously, I know you've recently retired, but when did the idea come to mind?
That was years later in 2013 when my wife and I were on holiday in France, and we were visiting some battlefields of the First World War in the Somme region. And we also visited several cemeteries, mainly where British soldiers were buried. And when I was there, I discovered that there was another cemetery nearby um, with soldiers from the Second World War. And one of them was a man whose name I already knew, and that was Ronald Bolton Littledale. So we went to this village. It's called Arran in the Somme. It's very close to the Somme River. And well, we got there, and when I was there, I said to my wife, "Well, I have to find out about this man. What is he doing here in France?" And well, just wanted to find out. What is it possible to recreate the life of someone who has been dead for so long. And well, it started as a small project, but well, we're 12 years further now, and look what happened.
Indeed, many congratulations. Maybe they say the first is the hardest, so we'll see how the next one goes if there is a next one.
Yes, you never know.
You never know. So the title of the book, "The Betrayal of Colditz," introduce us to that as an idea.
Um, well, there is. I have many. I had many titles in mind, and I had to pick some title. There's another title that came second, and that is The Strange Death of Mike Sinclair. But The Betrayal of Colditz has several meanings. Colditz, as a lot of people I think in England know, is a very famous story. And it's always about prisoners of war trying to escape in the most ingenious ways, and they often succeed. And of course, that's a very brilliant story. It has power in it. It's about intelligent people doing very brave things. They have courage, and well, it also is a kind of a myth. There are little books about what happened to the man really in that castle. And once you get there, you probably understand. It's a very big castle, but it's when you're inside, it's very small. And imagine you're there for 5 years. People can go mad, and well, those stories are hardly ever told. So I focused in on that part of the story, and writing this story, and we'll come to it later. More or less is a betrayal to this story because I'm not telling only the great escapes and all that, but also who these men were and what problems they had and what history they have. And to do that, I had to write a biography. Who were these people? Were they married? Did they have children? What about their parents? Did they have a trauma? Were they hurt during the battle in which they were taken prisoner or whatever? So it's a complete different look at Colditz.
Yeah, I agree. And so going back to Littledale for a second, so I was obviously he's captured early in the war. Do you kind of want to give us a brief introduction to kind of his background, his movements up until Colditz as such?
Yes, well, he was born in Sandway in Cheshire, in the neighborhood of Liverpool. I think Stephen Benson is in the audience. He knows better than I do because he lives there. Um, and he comes from a family. Um, well, I'm not sure if it's upper class, but a rich family. His family comes from the Lake District. The people were either mayor of Liverpool or explorer going to Tibet or in the army. They went to Eton, they went to Cambridge, Oxford. So he was, Ronald Littledale was destined to go to prep school. He was going to Eton, and then he joined the army, like most of his family did. And his first appointment was in Germany, in the neighborhood of Cologne, after the First World War, and then he came back to England. He went to Palestine during in the 30s. He went to India, and well, when you read the book, you will notice that nothing much happened there, at least not for Ronald Littledale. It really became problematic for him when when the Second World War started, and that's when the troops around Calais were surrounded, and well, fortunately enough, a lot of them came back to England through the the Jep, what do you call it? When 300,000 troops got back from Jep. But he was in a small contingent fighting near Calais, together with Mike Sinclair, as I already mentioned. And he was caught there. He was taken prisoner and sent into prison to a prisoner of war camp in the south of Germany.
Yeah. Okay. And you've mentioned Mike Sinclair there, and he obviously, as much as Littledale plays a massive part in the story here, known as the Red Fox. Maybe give a bit of introduction for those who may not know him as well.
Um, well, I came up with this idea that I tried to write a story about Ronald Littledale, but it turned out to be a story about Mike Sinclair. And Littledale is more or less of a shadow of a man standing in the spotlights. And Mike Sinclair is always standing in the spotlights. He's a very young officer. He was born in 1918. He's 16 years younger than Littledale. They were in the same regiment. And well, I have a collection of 70 books about Colditz now. I'm still missing some 10 or 12 books. And Mike is always there in the books. Why? Because he's a very ingenious man. He's cunning. The Germans gave him the name the Red Fox. He was always thinking of great escape schemes, and he tried many times to escape from the prison that surrounded him, and but he never succeeded. And um, on his last attempt in 1944, he was shot. So, but you in all the books you will find something about him. And strangely enough, he's the most important prisoner, I think, of Colditz, and most of the well-known prisoner. There's never been a book about him. No one ever wrote a book about him. That's a bit strange. And following his shadow, and I think Little is more or less his shadow because he's pretty unknown. Um, led to the conclusion what was really going on. At least that's my opinion. And why he tried to escape at a point in the war when it was no longer necessary to escape.
He was perhaps the most famous prisoner not to escape in the sense of completing a home run.
Yes.
A couple of other names to throw into the mix, obviously, Pat Reid, Airy Neve. They're probably the two names that will come to most people's minds with Colditz alongside Sinclair. So
Yes.
why do you think Littledale is perhaps not as well known as that trio or others?
I think because he was one of the many. And you mentioned Aaron Neve and Pat Reid. Well, Pat Reid, of course, wrote several books on Colditz, and he was able to tell the story. I mean, Mike wasn't, but he became famous because of all his escape attempts. And Littledale never wrote a book. He couldn't. He died before the war was over. Uh, Pat Reid, of course, wrote the books. There was a film, there was a series, and of course, he became famous because of that. Aaron Eve was the first British prisoner of war to escape from Colditz. Um, he was, after the war, taking part in the Nuremberg trials. He became a member of parliament. It was working with Margaret Thatcher, and in the end, his car was blown up in the Houses of Parliament. So that's a story. And he wrote also several books on the Battle of Calais, about the Nuremberg trials. And well, we have a saying here in Holland, we have our own war heroes. And once someone asked one of them, how do you become a hero? And he said, well, you have to learn to write. And I think that's true. When you can tell a story, or you have a good story and others will tell it, then you will become known, well known. And well, Littledale never wrote a story; he couldn't. And well, when I hadn't been to France on holiday, I think no one would have written the story in the end.
Yeah, I think, I mean, as you say, they're saying history is written by the victors or perhaps the survivors, and unfortunately, Little Dow, upon escaping home, he, followed honor as such. He wanted to get back into the war, wanted to rejoin his regiment, and sadly, that would lead to his demise following D-Day. I don't know if while we're talking on the subject, perhaps we should cover off what does happen to him. How does he die?
Well, after his escape from Colditz, he gets to Switzerland, and he gets there with Billy Stevens, one of the four men who escaped in October 1942, together with Pat Reid and Hank Wardle. But he's one of the few to get out of Switzerland as soon as possible. The others stay behind in Switzerland. Pat Reid stayed until after the war. He goes to Spain, and through Portugal, he finally flies back to England. And he stays there for over a year while the armies are being completed until D-Day arrives. And on June 6th, and some days later, he goes back to France again. And he's still a major then, but soon after he landed in France, he becomes lieutenant colonel, because the commanding officer of his unit is regarded to be too old. And well, on that very first day of September 1944, exactly 5 years after the World War II started, he's in a unit trying to find out what's going on in a small town called Arrain. And this town is surrendered by the British Army, and they're trying to find out if there are still German troops there. And well, it's a bit strange. I think so anyway. I thought it was strange that the lieutenant colonel is doing a reconnaissance tour in a small town where probably German troops are. But anyway, he goes there. And the official history of his unit says he was too willing to go there without waiting for backup. So, excuse me. And his unit drives into town, and well, um, there's a battery. Is it a battery? Well, anyway, his half truck is bombed, and he is killed instantly, and so are several other soldiers of his unit. And finally, they're buried there in Arren, in the Arren cemetery.
Hmm.
And that was the 1st of September. And nearly 3 weeks later, Mike Sinclair escaped from Colditz and was killed as the only prisoner in Colditz being killed during an escape attempt.
And I guess to conclude on Sinclair's final escape as such, do you want to just talk a little bit about the kind of the situation around that in terms of the timings and how it plays out?
Yes. Well, it's very strange that he tried to escape at that point of the war. It was September 1944. The British Army was fighting in the streets of Arnhem. The Russians were near Warsaw. The Americans had just liberated Florence. So there was actually no need for him to escape anymore. And what's further strange is that they made several escape attempts after months of studying what the Germans were doing, making uniforms, dressing up as a German sergeant major trying to escape. Um, and it was very ingenious. But on this last escape attempt, He just jumped over the wire in broad daylight, and the German guards were shouting to stop, but he didn't, and he was shot. And um, well, that was the end of Mike Sinclair. And I never understood that when I was reading all these books when I was a child and later on. And when I was writing this book, I think I found a reason why he tried to make this last fatal attempt. Some people say, some of the old prisoners who were there and watched it said, well, he was going crazy. It wasn't Mike Sinclair anymore. There must have been something wrong with him. And there's a strange line in one of the books written by Philip Pardo, is a lieutenant from the same regiment as Mike Sinclair, and he says, well, there are perhaps 10 people knowing what was going on at the time, but it has to be a secret for the time being. And, well, I think I found a secret why he did it, why he tried to escape at this point of the war, and what went on in his mind. Yeah.
Okay, well, you tease that well. Um, so I think let's go back a little bit now. So before we get to Colditz, how how do Littledale, there's an earlier escape that Littledale is on and Sinclair is on. Talk to us about how that comes about and the implications of it.
Yes. Well, we have Ronald Littledale, we have Mike Sinclair, and there's number three, Chris Davis Caulfield. And there's three of them. And Chris is also part of this the same regiment as the others are. They're all taken prisoner in Calais, go to a camp in the southern part of Germany. And after a while, they're taken to an old fort in Poland in the area of Posen. And today it's called Poznan, but in those days it was called Posen. And it was an underground fort there, and the situation there was very bad. And it was a kind of reprisal because the Germans thought that their prisoners over in Canada were treated very badly. So they wanted to do something about it, but it turned out to be a mistake. But um, Ronald, Mike, and Chris escaped from this camp and were held by the Polish resistance. And there are a lot of stories about soldiers escaping from camps in Poland and being held by the Polish resistance. And as you have the book and you look in the back, you will find a list with a lot of names, a lot of Polish names, very difficult to pronounce for me. And it took me a while to get all the names in place and what the connections of these people are. And the three, Chris, Mike, and Ronald, were trying to travel to Russia, which there wasn't a war with Russia at that time. And they had to cross a borderline of the general government. It's the border of the Great German Reich, as you can say. And it was heavily guarded, but the Polish resistance knew a way to get them over the border. And they succeeded. But once they were there, they found out that Germany had invaded Russia and they couldn't go to Russia anymore. And then they decided to go to Turkey because that was the next neutral country at the time. So they split up. Once they were in Warsaw, Chris stayed behind. It was a risk to travel with too many people. So Mike spoke fluently German. Ronald was at the highest rank at the time. So these two soldiers, Mike and Ronald, were taken over the Balkans on their way to Turkey. And they finally ended in the eastern part of Serbia. At the time, it was invaded by Bulgarian troops. and by a check up by control, there was something wrong with the papers, and they were arrested. They were interrogated and handed over to the Germans, and they were taken on a train to Colditz. Now they jumped off. Mike was arrested instantly, and Ronald got away and ended up in Prague. And well, so far for the Polish resistance. And you can see in the book that Ronald finally gets arrested in Czechoslovakia after the murder on Heydrich in 1942. And then Ronald goes back to Colditz, and there's a funny thing in the book that Gris wrote after the war, because he's the only one who survived the war, and he wrote a book about his time in Poland and in Colditz. And it's a short period that Gris, Mike, and Ronald are together in Colditz. And well, I think they have a lot to tell to each other, but somehow things are not told in the book. And when you read my book, you will probably understand why things are not being told. And I think that's another explanation for the title of my book. To me, it seems that some stories I discovered and are written in the book are not being told for whatever reason that may be. It seems like I'm betraying some secret that has been lying there for 80 years. And that's, I think, the second explanation for the title of the book.
Yeah, so I guess just to add a little bit more to that, and obviously people will read more in the book, but the suggestion is that from obviously the various sources you've consulted, that the that when being interrogated, certain information is passed on, which results in members of the resistance being killed.
Yes, they passed on information. They were involved in what happened finally to the Polish helpers, and the kind of information they gave, or what they gave, and under which circumstances. Well, you should read it in the book, and it makes it for me more clear why they did what they did in the end. Why Mike jumped the fence, tried to escape when it was no longer necessary. Why Ronald made a reconnaissance while it wasn't necessary. But yeah, that's I think that the main theme of the book.
Yeah, yeah. So I guess as you've alluded to, because this is a different kind of narrative than the one previously told. So all of the books you had studied uh, before writing your own, you've obviously over time formed an opinion of the key characters, a perception of these characters, such as Littledale and Sinclair. How did your perception change? Did it change towards any of these characters?
Hmm. Um, well, to me, they're still heroes, but they're more human. They've become more human to me. I always had this image of these people, and not only British soldiers, but also the French and the Poles and the Dutch. Um, and I knew there was something about this Colditz story. I mean, it's all about uh, heroes doing great things, and I always knew there must have been a layer, an extra layer in this story. I mean, nowadays we get soldiers coming back from a war and they're traumatized. I mean, what about these people in Colditz? They must have been traumatized one way or the other. They have had terrible experiences. They stayed in this castle for years. And I can imagine that these people also have nightmares had nightmares after war. I've had an uncle who was a prisoner of war himself in Germany, and 6 years later, he still was having nightmares. I mean, how often do you read about nightmares from the man of Colditz? Having you don't read that, but I'm sure they had, and they were perhaps traumatized or whatever, or had experiences they don't want to tell because all they tell or what is told about them is these wartime stories of heroism.
Yeah. And as you say, I think that there are so many heroics that take place kind of in and out of the castle. Some small kind of acts of defiance, some larger, and I guess the enduring legacy of all of these prisoners of war, is that kind of the resilience that they showed in really difficult circumstances. And now obviously we're reading of their stories, 80 odd years on, and
Yeah.
hopefully for many years to come.
Yes, and there's one book in my collection. It's called The Colditz Myth, and that makes it, I think, more realistic. And it's an historian, Mackenzie, and he writes what happens to people that become prisoner of war and how they're being treated by the Germans or tortured or put one against the other or shot or whatever, and how these people react, and it gives a completely different view on prisoners of war, and that was something I was missing in the entire Colditz history until I came up with this story, and I thought, well, it makes them more human, and of course they were great soldiers fighting for their country, making um, trying to escape, and they finally succeeded, or and came back and to fight again. And I mean, in a way, they're still heroes, but they're human heroes, and that's something different, I think.
Definitely, definitely. Something we discussed is it's obviously quite interesting that a Dutchman would be writing about effectively two Englishmen as the key characters, as opposed to maybe some of the Dutch that are at Colditz.
Sorry, that last thing I didn't hear.
So as opposed to because there were Dutch prisoners at
Yes,
Colditz, I believe.
yes,
Yeah, yeah. So it's obviously quite interesting that your first book about Colditz is about the English prisoners as opposed to
yes.
the Dutch ones.
Yeah. Um, my third time in college was in 2019, and I held a presentation on my project. And there was one Englishman asking me, "Why don't you write a book about the Dutch prisoners?" And I thought, well, that's a good question. Why don't I? And over a year ago, I came in contact with Johan van Hoppe. I'm not sure if he's watching this program, but um, he's a retired soldier, an officer of the Dutch army. And he has been writing about the Dutch officers in Colditz. And he asked me my assistance to help him with his book. So we're now writing this book about these Dutch officers in Colditz because there's little known or written. There's much known but little written about them, and that's a book we are working on at the moment.
Great. And something we haven't mentioned is the Colditz Society. So you're obviously a member of the Colditz Society, and you're going to be going back to Colditz with them soon.
Yes, I will be going there with the society in April, and we'll be there to celebrate the 80th liberation of the castle. Uh, and I became a member in, I think, 2012 or something like that. And the society was founded, I think, in the early 90s when a lot of prisoners, ex-prisoners, were still alive and were invited by the society. And they're almost all gone now, but the society is still there. And well, it's a society for people who are interested in Colditz and all the stories. And well, that's how my book also started. When wanted to write about Littledale, I was asking around for information, and I came up with a man called Joe West. And I told him, well, I have an MI9 report. Littledale returned to England and he was debriefed by MI9, and there was a report about this. And it's in the public domain. You can find it on the internet. And he said, well, in our case, there's half a page missing in this report. And I was, well, stunned. I thought, why? Is there a specific reason? And well, we had some mail contact, and then I asked him, could you give me the complete report? Because I knew he had it. And he didn't answer. And months later, his wife answered because he had something in his brain and he couldn't speak anymore. And well, that was the end um, of our communication. And Joe unfortunately died last year, but he gave me the number of this debriefing report from the National Archives. And once I got my hands on that, well, it all started for me, the journey that finally ended in the book. Because the missing page was, well, you can say it might raise an eyebrow. I call it explosive. But you have to read the book to find out what's going on with this document.
Indeed. So before we call time and ask, open the floor to audience questions, on a bit of a light-hearted note as such, what's your favourite escape? It doesn't necessarily have to be one that's in the book.
Um, my favorite escape. Wow, that's a nice question. I think yeah, it must be Mike Sinclair. He it was so brilliant what he was planning and doing, and I think the 60 seconds escape he made in early 1944 is one of the most brilliant escapes. Very daring. Uh, he, uh, he jumped out of the window for about 10 yards, and then he made another jump of 10 yards, all of course hanging on a rope. But anyway, in the dark, and well, he got out, and he was captured near Holland. Uh, so unfortunately, he didn't make it, but
Hmm.
it was astonishing to see him do that. Only months after he had been shot during another escape attempt, when he was dressed up as a sergeant major, German sergeant major. So, I mean, he really is the man standing in the spotlights for good reason.
Definitely. Well, I think that's a good place to leave it. Before I turn off the recording, obviously have the your book on screen. It's available to buy via our website, so barnformpublishing.co.uk. If you're overseas, you perhaps would prefer Amazon, just because it will be a bit cheaper on the postage internationally. So yeah, please buy away. Kees, thank you very much for an interesting presentation. As I say, I'm going to end the recording now, and then we will ask the audience if they've got any questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ashley.